Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My name is Tasneem Chopra. I'm going to be engaging in a conversation with Brother Ghaith Krayem on Muslim Votes Matter. Before proceeding, I would like to offer an acknowledgement to country. I acknowledge the continuing connection to culture, lands, waterways and communities of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here, being the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Burrung people, and pay respects to past and present traditional owners of country throughout Australia. We pay respects to the ancestors, elders and storytellers who've maintained spiritual customs of women's business and men's business, passing ancestral knowledge through generations of kin, from kinship care, from auntie to mother to daughter to sister, from uncle to father to son to brother. So, Ghaith, assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
Good, alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah.
We're getting to that pointy time in the national calendar where election is looming, conversations are brewing, the world's on fire. There's a lot going on, and Muslim Votes Matter has managed to put itself on the agenda.
Alhamdulillah.
Yes, it's and people are talking, but there's a lot of questions.
Absolutely.
I think would be really valuable to clear up, so that people have a better understanding and can distinguish from the hype, from the fact, hopefully through your clarification on so many issues. But before we get started, can you just tell us a little bit about your background on, your time here in Australia, your maybe professional background and your interest in this space?
Sure. Personal background, my story is probably not that different to a lot of my generation within the community. You know, my parents came out in the late 60s from Lebanon, so I've got a Lebanese background. They were economic migrants, so they weren't fleeing the civil war. They came up well before the civil war, and I think to a certain extent that influenced how we experienced life in Australia. Very different, I think, from those who migrated in sort of the 70s and the 80s. I grew up in Cronulla of all places.
Oh, really?
So in the heartland of white Australia, if you like.
Gosh.
And in fact, I actually didn't have Lebanese, let alone Muslim friends, until I went to university. So I grew up very much in the Aussie culture.
Okay.
And so, I guess my journey is a bit of a journey around recentering culturally who I was, and religiously who I was, and I think part of my activism has evolved as I've connected with my Muslim identity over 30 odd years, and I think it's changed over that period of time and culminated, I guess, into where we are today, where my faith is very much a part of my activism and drives a lot of the things that I do.
Okay, that puts a lot of context into. Well, then I guess the next question is leadership roles that you've taken on in the community, through your career, both within the workspace, but also within the community sector space.
Yeah.
Has that in any way informed your ascent into the Muslim Votes Matter field, and why?
Look, I've never gone after a leadership role. That's just not the way. I worked, and a lot of the drive around community activism for me came from my father, and he passed away recently, and that always gives you time to reflect. And he was one of that generation that really was part of the foundation of the community in this country, and I guess the two things that he really instilled in us is, no matter what you have, be grateful for what you have, and the best way of showing that gratitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is to serve. So if there's something that you can do, just do it, right? It doesn't matter at what level it is, as long as it's bringing benefit to the community, just do it. And I think for me, a big part of it is, it probably doesn't even sound rational, but at some point we're going to be standing, in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we're going to be judged. And the thing in the back of my mind is always, have I done enough with what Allah has given me? And you can never answer that as saying yes. So you're always wanting to do that next little thing, just in case that's the thing that saves you on the day of judgment.
Well, I mean, aren't we always supposed to be striving to learn? You know, life isn't constant education and state of improving ourselves. And I think to that end, the development of Muslim Votes Matter as an entity. Can you tell us a little bit about what inspired you specifically to work in that field?
Yeah.
And what inspired you to work in that field, and did it have a particular meaning to you personally?
Look, like a lot of people, Muslim Votes Matter and my connection in that space, you know, really, you know, was came out of what was happening in Gaza, you know, nearly a year and a half ago, and I'd been out of frontline community for nearly 10 years, so since I was with the ICV, the Islamic Council of Victoria. You know, I was back doing very grassroots stuff, but after October of last, well, not last year, the year before.
23, yeah.
I could see very quickly that we were about to go into a repeat of what we had been through before. Even the language of terrorism and portraying everything through that lens of terror was almost a repeat of what we had gone through a decade or more earlier. And I couldn't stand by and just allow that to happen again, because we saw what the whole war on terror really led to, and we know it was based on a lie now, right? Mm. And in the early days after October 23, the whole narrative was around this issue of terrorism and portraying everything from a terror perspective, which meant almost any response that was going to come was going to be excusable, because we saw that happening a decade ago. And for those of us who've been sort of very, very mindful of what had been happening in Palestine for the last 10, 20 years, we could tell exactly where this was going to end up. And we were seeing the rhetoric coming out of Israel around, you know, what is clearly now genocidal intent. And we could see politicians back here just lining up to take on that narrative. And there wasn't even an attempt to contextualize or to even look at what had led up to those events. And for me personally, I just felt I didn't see enough happening structurally at a community level. And I just felt that we need to do something around repositioning how we responded as a community to some of these events.
Do you think there's a space for Australian Muslims to engage politically, and is that the purpose of Muslim Votes Matter?
Yeah, look, really the essence of what Muslim Votes Matter is about is redefining how our community engages politically. Is there a space? Absolutely there's a space. In fact, it's not a question of whether there is a space or not. It's a question of who fills that space and how they go about filling that space. And what we really saw in the last year or so is the way in which we have engaged politically has failed us.
Okay.
The fact that we found it so difficult to oppose a genocide, which should have been the easiest thing to do morally and legally.
But you're talking from a government perspective.
From a government perspective, yeah, right. So in terms of influencing government's language and positions on this issue, morally and legally should have been the easiest thing for anybody to be able to do. And the fact that we've got so little shift in government over the last 15 months says the way in which we engage politically and what we were doing and how we were doing clearly failed. And movements like Muslim Votes Matter wouldn't exist if we had have actually been successful in our political evolution. So we exist because there is a gap, and the community needs someone to help fill that gap. That's really what we're after about.
Okay, then so if we were to break it down, we know what we weren't doing in it. We weren't doing enough or doing anything in strategically or collectively in the past. Now this MVM, Muslim Votes Matter, it exists. Presumably there's a strategy, there's a modus operandi that it's going to deploy. What are its key goals, and how will you know it's working?
Sure. Look, in the short term, our key goals are focused around the next federal election in the short term.
Okay.
Long term, or underneath that, the key goals are, one, to convince our own community that it has political power. because in a lot of cases, our own community hasn't accepted or doesn't believe it has political power, because it's accepted a certain narrative around the way politics works and the role of faith communities, but certainly our community politically. So we're out to convince the community that it actually does have political power. If it chooses to use it and use it strategically, it can get some really better outcomes for the community. In terms of the short goals around this federal election, we want to educate people around the way the system works. We want to break the duopoly, right? We have other choices, right? The fact that for decades we have felt that we can only vote one or two ways. This whole notion of accept the devil you know as opposed to the devil you don't know, the lesser of two evils, all of that stuff. That the system wants you to think that, right? And yet the system's not designed around political parties. So we're trying to say to the community there are other options, and we have the ability to create other options. But ultimately, what we're saying is, as a community, we need to start holding politicians and governments to account for the outcomes. We've engaged politically, historically, based on relationships. So the relationship that we have with those in power has become our measure of success. The fact that we have a relationship is a success. Whereas for our perspective, no, a relationship is worthless if there's no tangible outcome to the community. And those relationships historically served us well when we're talking about building mosques and schools and what have you. But we should have been shifting decades ago to a different set of outcomes that we need as a community. The last decade, our fight around Islamophobia, around racism, around freedom of religion, all of those things, we didn't shift politically in a way that would allow us to actually engage on those issues properly.
Now, I just ask, because there's a lot of change that's then being required of a community that, if I'm understanding you right, has not, for various reasons, demonstrated a certain level of, shall we say, political and voter literacy about either not understanding the process of how a political system works, because it can be confusing, even concepts like preferential voting, for example, confused me for years. How then are you going to address that misinformation, well, not even misinformation, but perhaps confusion that people have been harboring for maybe since they could vote, which in some cases we're talking decades?
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of ways. First of all, education is a big part of what we will be doing both now, but also long term, and education on a number of fronts. One, around the way the system operates. So we've got a training. I don't use the word training package, but we have a training session which is available for all communities around the way the system operates itself. So there's a whole idea of preferential voting, how preferential voting works, the differences between the Australian system and some other systems internationally, and why you can't just pick up what is happening in England or the US, for example, and translate here. So, and the importance around how just to make your vote count. If you're going to go to the polling booth, don't waste your vote, right? Little things like don't write something on the ballot paper, because that's grounds for your vote to be discounted if you do. Right? So we've got those sorts of education campaigns, but then there's also a big piece around advocacy. So we've got a very long-term vision around in between elections, because the real work happens in between elections to really drive the advocacy across the community. That means policies, that means research, understanding the issues, helping the community understand what those issues are. So even right now, helping community understand what is the real issues that are at play in, say, Gaza, in Palestine, in the current situation that's happening in America. What is Trump really trying to do here? Helping the community really just elevate its understanding on those political issues. So whenever you do make a political decision, whatever that may be, whether you follow our guidance or not, at least you're doing it from an informed perspective. Right?
On that particular point, there might be detractors who will say, look, the Muslim community is bigger than one issue. Yep. We're not just Palestine, Gaza. What about environment? What about education? What about health, infrastructure, foreign policy, citizenship? There's a myriad of issues. Is MVM is it a one policy? Is it a one issue movement?
Absolutely not. So we're right now in the middle of our process around assessing candidates. So we will be issuing a how to vote card for every single seat across the country, all 150 seats.
Wow. 150 seats.
Absolutely. So there is a group of seats which we are focusing on, where we are engaging directly with people who have already announced their candidature. There's other seats which we will be doing based on party policy platforms. Right? So we've issued we've invited candidates to complete a questionnaire. That questionnaire has 14 different categories.
So just to be clear, every candidate will know about Muslim Votes Matter.
Absolutely.
Whether they respond and take it up is on them, but you are reaching out to every good candidate. I think that's a very important point to make. You're not just cherry picking who you contact. Okay.
Yeah, no, I say to people, you won't necessarily agree with what we're doing while we're doing it, but that won't be because we are not doing what we're doing based on information and facts and data, right? You may draw different conclusions, but one thing you won't be able to say about MVM is that we're not doing anything from an informed perspective.
Well, that's be democratic, isn't it? So, yeah.
So there's 14 categories, and they go everywhere, obviously from Gaza and Palestine all the way through climate change down to domestic violence. So we're asking candidates to give us their position on 14 different categories. But at the heart of it, Gaza really it's not an issue, it's a cause. And what I mean by that is this: how do we trust any government, any politician who has been willing to stand by and allow the slaughter to go on with our own livelihood, with the education of our children, with the health of our ill and our sick? How do you trust a government that is not prepared to make decisions based on principles when we're talking about genocide, where they're allowing political interests at that level? So if we can't influence that, then what hope do we really have to influence them on our religious freedom, have you? All this comes down to, we need to demonstrate that we have the ability to impact them politically. And when you boil it all down to, that is our ability to remove people from Parliament. Once we can demonstrate that we can, then the whole conversation will change.
How does that notion and idea, I guess, of pretty astute political activism, and very directed, I should say, how does that align with, I guess, the Islamic principles of civic responsibility and justice?
From my perspective, it's at the absolute heart of it. I mean, there are so many things within our faith which tell us we shouldn't be standing by silent, right? So, we all know the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, which says, when you see evil, you have to stop it with your hand. If you can't do that, then with your tongue, and if you can't do that, then hold it in your heart, right? Now, we can't physically go and support our Palestinian brothers and sisters, but we can certainly speak up about it. But what we can do is actually, within our own context, influence those people who are making those decisions which are impacting us, not just in terms of Gaza, but impacting us in terms of our ability to practice our faith, in terms of our ability to actually have input into those societal issues here, which Islam actually has really important things to say. There's debates right now around gambling and alcohol, for example. The government is backtracking on legislation it was proposing around gambling. Islam has really, really strong things to say about gambling, but we're not even part of that conversation. No one's coming to us even on those sorts of issues. We want to reposition our team to be able to say, what, we have value to add to society on a whole range of issues. It's time for you now to take us seriously on all of those things.
Okay, and I mean, what do you think then that means for a politically empowered? I mean, what would a politically empowered Australian Muslim community look like if all of this worked in 10 years? How do you envision the landscape to look like?
Oh, I can envision a lot in 10 years. Look, I think the heart of it is the community has institutions and structures, not MVM per se, but a whole range of institutions and structures which are built and designed to help the community understand what its critical issues are, what faith says about those issues, and the value those things bring to society as a whole, and then our ability to bring all of that into the political space. And MVM, as it currently stands, is in that last category, right? We need to build all of that infrastructure as a community so that end to end, when we're out there talking about all these different issues, we're talking about it from a very informed position. We're not just saying things because they sound nice, right? We're not being emotional about something. If we're going to run a policy that says, we want the government to change its position with respect to gambling, for example, What's the research say on those? What are the societal issues on those? Because we all know that whole spectrum is all influenced by who's driving that work. So if we don't have our input into each part of that, each stage of that process, what we end up with is not always what we would say would be aligned to our values and our positions. So we want to be able to cover that whole spectrum so the community can genuinely feel like its interests from start to finish are being understood and presented in a meaningful way.
Has this initiative and idea been, has it been modelled in other countries where you can look to as a proof of concept and say, yes, minority Muslim communities in this Western country or that Western country have, collected in the same way with a particular outcome to actually draw upon?
Yeah, well, the best example is actually Britain in last year's British elections. They have a movement called the Muslim Vote over there. Now, remembering the systems aren't the same, but they did have a movement that was trying to mobilise them politically, and it was very successful. It could have been more successful for a whole range of reasons, but it was actually very successful. That on their assessment, they would say that they got 5 independent politicians elected based on their movement. We had a case over there where a young Muslim candidate came within 500 votes of unseating a Minister of Parliament, right? Now, the British system is different. The British system is what's called first past the post. They don't have preferential voting. So it's just whoever gets the most votes. The preferential voting system, she probably would have won, right? So there is the example of what occurred in Britain, and we've had a lot of conversations with the brothers and sisters over there around their challenges and what they did. And as I said, you can't just pick that up and put here. It's a different context, different environment, but it certainly worked for them.
What do you think are some of the misconceptions the public hold about, the Muslim approach to political engagement that you might have to counter in the conversations that you're having when you bring this topic up, when you even get to, when you even get started on explaining what MVM is? People have stereotypes. They have their biases. What are you hearing, and how are you responding?
Well, the most obvious one is when we hadn't even gone public, when we started getting the press and the political establishment running this line around, you can't have religion in politics, right? Which is an absolute nonsense, right? I mean, religion has always been part of Australian politics. And I can give you 1,000 different examples, not least of which is that every single day our federal parliament opens up with the Lord's Prayer, every single day, right? So this idea that, you don't have religion in politics is just nonsense. But they run that line because they're trying to scare people around that. So you've got this stereotype around whenever Muslims want to come at something and there's the label of Islam or Muslims in whatever we're doing, then there's this fear factor that it's somehow, a theocracy, and it's all about, introducing Sharia law and all of those old tropes that we've had to deal with.
Yeah.
And then we have people say, well, why do you put Muslim in the title? Surely all votes matter, right? And our response to that is really simple. There are hundreds of organisations out there that enable the average Australian to have their voice heard. There is not one that is aimed at specifically creating a space and a channel for Muslim Australians to have the voice heard. The issues we're talking about are not Muslim issues. They are societal-wide issues. They're universal issues. Genocide is not a Muslim issue. Right? Gambling is not a Muslim issue. Climate change is not a Muslim issue. But we want to mobilise the Muslim community to engage on those issues. That's really the why we picked the name the way it was. Our focus is mobilising the Muslim community.
Does that mean there is or there is not capacity for people who are not from the Muslim community to get on board with the movement?
Absolutely. We have non-Muslim volunteers across the country.
Okay.
We've got Jewish volunteers within MVM, right? Because the values and the things we're talking about are things which resonate across the whole society, and those individuals aren't finding other groups which are right now providing them the channel that they need, right? So while we're focusing on mobilising the Muslim community, the issues and the factors apply to a lot of different minority communities.
Yeah, okay. It's funny because I'm thinking of the when the Black Lives Matter movement started and the detractors against it, who was like, "Oh, why are you saying Black lives? All lives matter." And a lot of the response to that clapback was, "Well, no. Once Black lives are seen on the same and equal footing as white lives and every other lives, then yeah, Black lives won't need its own movement. But until it does, Black lives matter." Right?
Yeah.
And I kind of think to this, from what I'm hearing that you're saying is we've been ignored, we're not being heard, our concerns aren't being taken on board. So our votes matter at this point. And until you see them, include them and agenda them.
Yeah. And the reality is there are equivalents of us for almost every faith and cultural community in the country, right? Why is, when the Muslim community mobilises in this sense, in this way, why is that controversial? But it's not when we've got hundreds of Christian lobby groups. We've got, at least a dozen Jewish Zionist lobby groups. We've got Hindu lobby groups. Almost every faith community has lobby groups. Why is the Muslim community, when it mobilises, controversial?
Yeah, I guess that's almost rhetorical.
Rhetorical question.
Could I ask you, given the climate that we're in and the impetus for this movement and what it's trying to accomplish, there may be young Muslim aspirants who are thinking, maybe I could do politics. What would you be saying to them in this climate about whether to do it, and how would you as an entity be able to support them?
I guess there's a couple of aspects to that. One, right now, I don't recommend personally anybody who wants to enter Parliament based on their Muslim identity and their Muslim values and principles to do it through a mainstream political party. What the last 15 months has clearly demonstrated to us is political parties will not allow individuals to take personal principled positions. You have to accept the party's position on all those sorts of issues. That will not change until we as a whole community demonstrate that we have political power, right? We saw that with, fourth payment in the Senate, right? I would advise anybody who wants to go down that path to start local, get involved in local politics. Councils are very different. Councils can do very much around your personal values and your personal positions. Get involved at that local level to start with. Understand how it works, understand how politicking works. It's a really good grounding rather than jumping into...
I guess on local government, does MVM have any ambition at this stage to also, infiltrate that space and have a presence in scouring candidates or giving advice or observing positions?
Long term, we would hope so, but right now it's a question of resourcing.
Okay, sure.
So there are thousands of councils across the country. So we don't have the ability to do it right now, but long term, in terms of the general support, as we build a more sustainable structure, we would absolutely want to do that. So I think, just really get a good grounding of it first, understand the way it all works, and really set yourself up. A lot of people sort of jump in because they're very motivated right now around a particular issue. That's not enough, right? You've got to build up your local support networks to really have a chance of succeeding politically. So start local is what I would say.
Brilliant. This is sort of backtracking to a previous question, but I just want to ask it because I think it's entirely topical. Critics would argue that encouraging Muslims to vote as a united bloc will promote division amongst a multicultural society. We're supposed to be acting in unity with all our diverse communities. How do you respond to that?
My response to it is people with shared values and interests always vote based on those values and interests, right? Mm-hmm. So to suggest that our community can't vote based on our collective values and interests, again, is placing a burden on us that other communities don't have to face. We're not saying that every single Muslim has to vote a particular way, right? That's nonsense, right? People will vote however they choose to vote. What we are saying is for us to harness and mobilise our political power, the one thing that we have which other communities actually don't have is numbers. And if we can harness those numbers strategically at certain points in the political process, that will get us political power.
Right.
And so what we're saying to the community is there are times when we should put aside personal interests, local interests, and put the community's interest, number one, and vote strategically at this point in time to get a very strategic outcome.
Right.
That doesn't mean we're going to all agree on economic issues, or we're all going to agree on even foreign policy issues. But we can agree that we've got to do something for the community. And at some point in time, we've got to say, you know what, let's put all that aside. Our aim right now is to harness political power. And the way we're going to do that is by getting as many people as possible to vote in the same way.
And I'm thinking earlier to your point about reaching out to all federal candidates. How many seats was it? 150?
There'll be 150 in the new parliament. There's 151 now. Yeah.
And with countless candidates, obviously, in that particular cohort, you're reaching out to every one of them to let them know who you are with the survey, and 14 issues that are or 14 topics in that survey. Can I ask, those 14 topics, how did you arrive at them? And once you weight the responses to those, how will they be weighted? Will you be prioritising the response to one issue? Will Israel-Palestine be higher rated than, say, education versus health versus housing? How will that play out? And who makes the decisions about the weighting?
Sure. In terms of how we arrived at those 14 categories, we do a bi-monthly poll of the community where our third one's about to go out, and we did an initial one back in May of last year. That's one source that we've identified those issues. We have, and when I say we, all of the people I'm talking about are completely volunteers, right? No one gets paid for any of this. We have a political strategy team, which is represented nationally, and they go back and talk to communities on the ground. What
are the numbers like at the moment? How many is in the MVM team nationally?
So nationally, in terms of our, not including those people who have signed on to help on polling booth day, so our active team nationally would be somewhere between 200 and 300 people.
Okay.
This is 200 to 300 people who are doing something in this space every day, every week.
Okay.
And the political strategy team right now is probably the hardest working team. And so they're through those channels, that's how those categories were identified. There is an analytical team that does all of our polling. They've developed the weighting that will go into those categories. There's no question that those categories are not equally weighted. Palestine absolutely will carry far more weight than some of those other categories, without a question. We don't resolve from the fact that the number one issue, and we know that because, you know, for example, in our last survey, we had over 2,000 respondents nationally. That's a bigger response rate than the political polls that you see in the daily press, right? The number one issue for our community is Palestine, is Gaza, without a doubt. So that will absolutely have the greatest weighting in assessing those categories.
Incredible. Yeah. All right. So that's quite the process, I guess, even statistically, and how you measure it all and get those numbers up and running. But it's good to have that accountability. And I guess, speaking of accountability, when you do engage with these candidates and you tell them who you are, what you're about, and what the MVM charter is, and to say, for example, a candidate that you've endorsed after election, post-election doesn't deliver when they said they would on a particular issue, do you have a recourse? Again, this is uncharted territory, really. But at this stage, what will MVM do if people don't come good on their promises?
Next time around, well, first of all, you hold those people to account, right? You go public. This is what we endorse you on this basis. You're not holding up. Why? And you need to challenge people on those sorts of things. But next time around, then it's likely that you're going to endorse that candidate or that party next time around. We don't even use the language around, there's this language around, our vote is for sale, right? No, our vote's not for sale. Our vote is for rent. We're saying we rent our vote from one election to another. And if you don't deliver on what you told us, well, we're going to shift our vote. That's where minority communities get political power, the willingness to shift vote. Part of the reason why we haven't succeeded as much as we have politically is because we've always generally voted in a particular way. And so the mainstream parties on one side take us for granted because we've never changed our vote, and on the other side ignore us because we've never changed our vote.
Yeah.
The moment both sides realise that we will swing our vote based on who's going to deliver what we need for our community, that's where you start to get better outcomes.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think that this is a watershed moment for the community in terms of being as organised as it's ever been in this moment for a political election. So it'll be fascinating to see how it goes. And I mean, you spoke about accountability and holding those, to account for breaches, etc. On that same issue, what levels of transparency or accountability is MBM subjecting itself to in terms of how it makes decisions, the funding that you get? Do you share details on how you choose the candidates that you endorse? What's your level of accountability?
I think, well, the first one is that we are what would be considered a significant party under the AEC legislation, the Electoral Commission legislation. So we are going to comply with what all lobby groups, if you like, would do around how we operate and funding, whatever of that sort. We have no big funder behind us. We're not like Climate 2000 or whatever, or Climate 200 or whatever that movement's called. Any funding we have has come just from average Muslims across the country. And people sometimes wouldn't believe how much we've been able to do on a very small amount of money. That's one that opens doors for you, right? In terms of the candidates, we will publish the categories, so people will know what the categories are. And based on that, we will obviously the how to vote card will show how we have rated and assessed those candidates. So that sort of covers that sort of transparency piece. And really from that perspective, but other than that, it's really making ourselves available for questions and being a fun community to respond to those issues. Sorry about that.
No, you lost a bit, but you came back again. Look, we haven't got too much on, but I want to just ask, with a name like MVM, Muslim Votes Matter, in the climate that we're living in, where there's been a chronic rise in racism and targeted vilification of minorities, has there been an increased experience of Islamophobia that any of the team members have felt, or in socials with a name and within a movement like this? And have you managed it, if there has been?
Absolutely, and it's the very reason why we don't share who the co-founders are. There's only two people who are publicly identifiable as Muslim Votes Matter. That's myself and Dr. Nasser from Perth, because when we started, the two directors their details were made public by the Zionist movement, and campaigns were run against those two people and their employers. It's been 12 months since that happened, and so it isn't a safe environment. That's just the reality, particularly if you work in corporate and what have you. So we are very mindful of protecting the identity of the key people and who's involved. No one is presented on our social media who hasn't agreed for them to be there. We limit our communication and how we communicate with each other, because all of that sort of stuff is very easily leaked out there. But we accept that that's going to happen, and it's part of the cost of doing this sort of work. And for some of us, there's less risk for us in playing those roles than for others. We take that on board, part and parcel of what we do, and we accept that we'll get through it. It comes in waves. Things are quieting down. It'll probably ramp up again before the election, and we'll have media writing all sorts of things about us. That's just the way it is. But this is how change happens, right?
Yeah.
We get through those barriers, because when we do, we'll be able to carry on, and others will see that we're able to do this. It'll give them a little bit more confidence to be able to do it and to stand up. And if we get political power, it also gives us a bit more power to protect and create safe environments for people to actually engage in some of this work.
Yeah, sure. And I'm wondering, and if you get that political power under the AC, are you offered some more protections in the case that, you know, those experiences of vilification and or harassment then are made towards you? Do you have a stronger case to litigate those if need be?
I'm not so sure it happens under the AEC, but as we get better at this, and as we build structures and institutions, then we are better able to use existing channels, right? So, for example, there is a media outlet, I won't say which one, it's not one of the mainstream ones, it's one of the faith ones, who went out with a story a few weeks ago which completely made up something that we said. That was just completely made up.
Mm-hmm.
Did them with notices, right? So
okay.
as our community starts to evolve and mature in the way to engage in this work, our ability to push back and to not just sit back and accept what we have for a very long time evolves as well. And the more we do that, the more those people start to think twice before they take liberties, if you like, with how they engage with us.
Excellent. I read that some people believe MVM's opposition to Labor or support for Greens is too rigid and could alienate potential allies. So how do you navigate political relationships, new ones, while staying true to your mission?
It comes back to principles. What we're really saying is, while political interests absolutely have to be taken into account, you have to have a core set of principles that you are doing all your work by. And we're not anti-Labor, we're not pro-Greens. We have values and principles that we are saying are important to us. And we will hold to account politicians against those principles and values. It's just unfortunate for the Labor Party that they are the incumbent government, and of the 32 seats across the country which have a significant Muslim population, 31 of them are held by Labor. It's just demographics. You don't hold people who aren't in power to account. You hold the people who are in power to account. That's one of our principles, right? So it's just unfortunate for them. But they're the ones who had the ability to make decisions, and they're the ones who made choices. When we hold them to account, then the message we're sending to all political parties and politicians is we're going to hold all of you to account when you have the ability to make those decisions, just like we are for this particular government.
Well, I guess on a more unrelated issue, what do you say to Muslims who feel that MVM doesn't represent their political views, or that it pressures them to vote in a certain way which they're not comfortable with?
At the end of the day, vote however you believe you need to vote. Just do it from an informed position.
Mm-hmm.
Right? If you decide that the genocide of Palestine is not your most important issue, that's fine. But don't deceive yourself in thinking, yes, it is, but I'm going to vote this way for X, Y, and Z, whatever the reason is. Understand the issues, understand the way the system works, and make the best informed decision that you can at this point in time. We can't force anybody to vote, right? What we're out there doing is saying, this is what we think the issues are. This is how we think the system operates. And we think the community will get the best outcome by going down a particular path. You agree or you disagree. That's Islam, right? We can't force anybody to do it. But what I will tell you is, after every single information session I have run across the country, the one common thing that I get told at the end of every one of those sessions is, just tell me who to vote for. When we get in front of people and we step them through this, people get it, they understand it. And they say, just tell me who to vote for now, right? The community's been on this journey for some time already. It's just the last 15 months has given us the catalyst and the impetus for people to actually say, you know what, I actually want to do something about it now.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, there are cohorts of our community that might think, just do the work and give me the answer, and I'll do it. But in fact, you're not just doing, I mean, you might be doing that for some people who just want an efficient resolution, but for those who want to understand the processes and understand the devil in the detail, sorry, astaghfirullah, but I guess the process to get to the end of where you are, you're also providing that information as well. So you're accessible and transparent where you need to be, but you're also able to assist those who just want an efficient response. Would that be a fair call?
Well, I'll give you an example to see. So people, one of the issues that people still have is this concern around whether what we're doing is going to inadvertently end up with Dutton getting to power, right?
With what?
With Dutton getting to power. I say, look, it's a valid concern, right? But you don't respond to these issues emotionally. So when people say that, I say, oh, Dutton needs 19 seats to win power. Give me the 19 seats that he's going to win. Now, I've been through every single seat, right? I've trolled the ASC data. I know the margins. Take me through the 19 seats that you think he's going to win, right? For him to win 19 seats, he needs a bigger swing than Howard got in 96 against Paul Keating, right? The chance of that happening is so small. It's not impossible, right?
Well, we're living in a world where Trump is having a second term, so nothing is impossible. You're right. But I guess if anything, the urge and call for an entity like MVM is probably greater than it ever was, given how entirely unpredictable the scenario is.
Sure, but again, we're also different systems. We don't run presidential elections, right? It's fundamentally different to America, and the voting pattern for the last 20 plus years in Australia has been away from the mainstream parties, right? I'm predicting that the Labor Party primary vote will be under 30% for the first time this election, first time in history, right? The combined primary vote of the two parties will be less than 60% this election. The votes aren't going to go from Labor to Liberal, Liberal to Labor. They're going away from them to independents and minorities.
Yeah.
Which means it's even harder for Dutton to get those 19 seats, right? So this is the sort of the detailed conversation we will have and can have with those people who want to get into that sort of detail.
Yeah, it's forensic and interesting, absolutely. I think for all the political nerds out there, this is just fascinating stuff. We have to end in a minute, but for those people who want to get involved and who want to stay informed with the journey of MVM, the impact that you're making, and how can they be a part of that? What's the best way to do that?
Best way is just to go on the website, right? So muslimvotesmatter.com.au, I think it is. I should know our website.
At the bottom of this little video, so just say look down.
Yeah, go on the website. You can register as a volunteer, or you can register as part of the voter database, where you just get updated information. There are links to all of our social media. Social media is the best way to just get the daily things that we do. And really, whenever you see an event, just come along, right? Come along, ask the questions, email, do all of those things. But all of its best place is through the website. That's the best way to do it.
Fantastic. That's a nice central point. And last fun question to take us out, Ghaith. If you could have a chai with any historical figure, political historical figure, dead or alive, who would it be and why?
I think for me, it would absolutely be Malcolm X. Right? So when I'm thinking, so I was having, not explaining why, I was having this conversation online with some of our supporters, right, in the last couple of days, who were very frustrated about the rate of change. Right? And I said, I've worked in change for 20 plus years, and what we are trying to do for our community is probably the most complex, difficult change project I've ever been involved in. And Malcolm X and the African American movement of the 60s and 70s is the closest thing that I can relate what we are trying to do to, right? I would love to be able to sit down with him and have a conversation around his journey, because in some respects, of course, he was a revert, he was a convert. How Islam changed his activism and the role it played in his activism, but also how he engaged with such a hostile political environment. Ours still isn't as hostile as he had, right? So there's lots of lessons that I would love to be able to pick up from someone like him.
Well, very impressive answer, I think, and a great note on which to end this conversation. Thank you so much, Ghaith Krayem. Your position with MVM is as
National spokesperson.
National Spokesperson. Thank you so much for your time today. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam.